Hey, welcome back to Content is Profit. Today, we chose to rerun one of the most exciting episodes, I'll say. This was an episode where we had the great Alex Sanfilippo, which is the CEO and founder of Podmatch, an incredible software that connects creators and provides a lot of solutions, especially in the podcasting industry, and Tom Rossi, the CEO of Buzzsprout, which is a platform where people host their podcasts. We had the pleasure to have them both in our studio, and we talked about the hidden value of content creation, and there's a lot of principles that we went there. So this episode actually released 2 to 3 months ago, but it's still so good. We were just in a mastermind a couple of days ago, and Tom came in and he talked about the importance of team members. So in this episode, it just reminded me that this episode we had in there and we had to re-release it. Also, we're recording a ton of new stuff that's coming into the studio. So that's going to be coming right after this. But again, we got incredible feedback and I don't want you to miss a lot of the information is here. Keep an eye out for the frameworks and some of the strategies that, Alex and Tom are using to run their content, what they see in the industry, right? Tom has this 50,000 feet view that most people miss, right? And Alex is like in the forefront of the technology of platforms like podcasting and how it's helping a lot of people increase revenues and help their business. So with that being said, enjoy the show.
We live in an industry which loves to tell us that the only way to value your podcast is based on the number of downloads. That's just not true.
If you really believe that what you do helps somebody else, is your duty to put it out into the world. But at the same time, we need to be educated. Like, what does it take for us to do this?
Genius.
It's everything.
So just genius. 4 guys talking about stuff.
We call that the porn set, right?
My girlfriend will come in and she's like, is this a podcast? Are you sure? I promise a podcast. It's not hard to fix. That's the thing. You just have to set yourself up for success. And right now the data shows that over 50% of people quit before reaching 8 episodes. It's because people have this perception of like, oh, I'm going to hit record and it's going to get out there and everyone's going to see it. And then you realize, okay, podcasting, what we're doing right now is 10% of the job, right? And there's the 90% that you might not find fun. Somebody might be listening to this and they might be thinking, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of effort.
Welcome
right?
to podcasting.
Welcome to podcasting.
We've got some
Hey,
fresh,
I'm
new young
Luis.
talent
And
doing some
I'm
things that I
Luis.
know you haven't
And you're
heard
listening to the
before.
Content is Profit podcast. Welcome, everybody, to Content is Profit podcast town hall edition. Hey, second time we do this. We had you on the first time, right, Alex? And now today we have a special guest. Well, both special guests, Alex.
Yeah.
You're still special.
Whoa. He said we only have one.
We only have one.
I'm never coming back. This is it. I'm done. Unless I'm special.
Popping the cherry of somebody. Tom Rossi, man, welcome from Buzzsprout.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely,
in your
man.
amazing studio.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yes, somebody has to clean it. Yes. And Alex, obviously, Podmatch, you, and you've been so good to us, man, this last few months, and we consider you a brother now.
Same.
You made it.
Thanks, man.
You made it.
It's a mutual feeling.
Yeah, Tom,
Thanks,
you will
man.
be considered a brother.
Yeah, what do I need to do to be a brother?
You have to be here at least twice.
Well,
So.
okay.
He's gonna be my future marriage counselor.
Oh, that's
That is-
right.
Yeah,
That's
that is
right.
true. That is.
Yeah.
That's what's up.
We're going to ride electric skateboards.
Yes.
But I got to bring my one wheel. So, anyways.
All right, I
Combined
want.
with Alex. Alex is a pro now.
I
Alex has been riding.
don't
Alex has been
fall
riding
if that makes me a pro. Sure.
the electric skateboard with me. Yeah.
There we go. We can have a learning day. I'm all about learning.
Sounds good.
You know,
Fonzie, keep us on track.
Get some bruises.
Keep us on track.
I wanted to lead with this statement, right? Because of course, podcasting town hall. We're gonna talk about the state of podcasting. So I just Googled this recently. So if one of you have a better data point, please feel free to correct me. The global podcasting market size was valued at $18.5 billion in 2022. Source, Grandview Research. So I wanted to leave with that because you might hear that and you might say there's a lot of opportunity in there. And we have, I would argue, probably the masters of indie podcastings out here, right? I mean, Buzzsprout, they host tons of podcasters. I would argue a lot of indie podcasters. Alex Sanfilippo is like, he carries the banner of indie podcasters, founder of Podmatch. I mean, what else can we ask for? So I'm curious, on your opinion on what does $18.5 billion represents as an opportunity for indie podcasters? Whoever wants to take it, you can fight each other. That's fine.
Go for it, Alex. What do you think?
Well, the first thing I
always like to mention with that is that like that is top line. So most of that money is going to a select few, right? And I'm not saying that to be discouraging by any means, because the bigger that number gets, we as indie podcasters collect kind of like what's left of that, right? Yep. And so if there's 1 billion total, then we get a small percentage of that 1 billion. If there's 18 billion, we get a small percentage of that 18 billion, right? So it's not just only the top, because some people are like, well, yeah, Joe Rogan's the world, get that, right? But the reality is it really does affect each of us, and the value not only of podcasters themselves, but the way people view podcasting. So because like when I got started like with my entrepreneurship show, which I thought was like going to put me on the map, it was in 2018, I think. And people were like, a podcast, what? And now if you tell an entrepreneur, even if they don't want to be on it, they don't want to listen to it, they're still like, oh, wow, that's cool. Right. And that top line number for many people just gives this perception of like, oh, no, there's some value there. There's something there. So those are kind of my thoughts. But Tom, I'm very interested in hearing yours as well.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about it. I think it's validating, maybe, like to see that. But imagine I'm going to assign a dollar value to how valuable TV is, right? Like nobody does that. There's no industry group that's advocating for a dollar value associated with TV, right? So I don't want to take away from the fact that it is validating podcasting by saying it is massively valuable. Yeah. But I would argue that it's more valuable than any independent group could come up with, right? What mechanism are they doing to assign that value? That whatever mechanism they're using, I think is the lowest form of value of assigning value to podcasting. Yeah. For example, we live in an industry which loves to tell us that the only way to value your podcast is based on the number of downloads. That's just not true. That's just not true. And you will never capture how valuable a podcast is that maybe only has, let's say, 500 listeners, which is an exceptionally good show. It would be in the top 10% of Buzzsprout podcasts. Over 100,000 podcasts, you'd be in the top 10% of our podcast if you had 500 downloads in your first 7 days after launching an episode. Well, that's not even going to show up on the radar of those people evaluating it. But if that is a consultant who's got a logistics podcast and they're selling consulting services to logistics companies, how do you value a $20,000 contract as a result of one listener who signed a contract? So anyways, I don't want to take away from the fact that I think it's awesome that they're assigning value to it. I just want to say that I think it's a low, whatever that number is, it's going to be low compared to what it's really worth.
Really is.
I love that. There's lots of variables, right? Obviously, we're talking about this, and I love what you mentioned here. The value is not equal to the downloads. Probably not every listener also is valued the same way for the host. So I think that's a very, very clever point out there. I'm pretty curious actually on, because context. We had Joe Pulizzi, right? The founder of Content Marketing Institute, come and talk to, Podmatch Elite members. And he was absolutely fantastic, right? And he mentioned this term, content entrepreneurs, right? And of course, right, at Content's Profit, we talk a lot about, probably content regarding content entrepreneurs. So I love what you mentioned about this podcast. It can be a consultant, right, that has a very small following, but he has so much affinity. He has built so much affinity with his audience that now he's able to monetize that. And I think that's where the opportunity is for a lot of the smaller podcasters.
Yeah, I think it's one example of how you could do that. Right. What we were just talking about a little while ago was talking about extracting value from your podcast instead of saying monetization. Because monetization, when you hear monetization, you think, how do I get dollars out of my podcast, which immediately leads to downloads and CPM. But there's so many other ways to get value. So you just talked about building an affinity with your listeners. It could also be building an authority with your listeners. Now I'm an expert, right? Because I've got a microphone and I've got a podcast and I'm talking about a topic. You can establish yourself as an authority in a specific area, right? But for both yourself and for your guests that you have on your show, you've now, built this. And so there's so many different ways to extract value that aren't, downloads or CPM related.
I remember when Content's Profit started as a Facebook live show. And we didn't call it a podcast. It was literally a Facebook live show. And then that was extracted and put on Buzzsprout, actually. We launched Buzzsprout. And that's what we told everybody. Hey, you want to come to the show? And it was a little bit different. And now I'm trying to think, why didn't we use podcasts? Maybe because the live show was the first way of entry. But now I think this number, what it represents is also, podcast is cool. It's more mainstream. Now, like people, you go to speak, we're like, hey, do you have a podcast, right? Now it's like almost like you must have that vertical on content if you want to be recognized in the industry of some sort, right? Regardless of the downloads, right? Because, for us, our journey, we've been presented with incredible opportunities, and we don't have thousands of downloads, right? It's like maybe the connection with the network that we've been able to build because of the show, because of the podcast. So I think it's like opening the door, right?
Yeah.
And but it's also maybe casting that shadow to a lot of new podcasters on like, oh, I want a piece of that pie. And they ignore completely what you were mentioning about, like, what's the hidden revenue behind it? What's the value that we can extract?
Hidden value. I like that. Hidden value. It's not even hidden money, right? We were talking about another example of just, for example, I would love to have a Star Wars podcast that was big enough just so that I could meet all the Star Wars people that I want to meet. If I could have Dave Filoni from Star Wars on my podcast, like that would I don't care if I ever, you know what I mean? Like to be able to sit across the table and have a conversation with people. And I know people that they have podcasts that have opened doors for them to have communication with people that otherwise wouldn't have happened. There's no dollars exchanging hands directly, but there's value that's being created.
Yeah.
I'm a co-host for hire. Just so you know, I'm available, and I'm very well versed in Star Wars.
I can talk about Star Wars for a long time.
I'm very well versed. I'm ready.
We'll have a Bad Batch poster ready for season.
We're transitioning right now to the Star Wars segment of the podcast. I think we found our headline.
I have no idea what all these names.
Hey, I've seen the movies, but honestly, my memory on that is not the best. You guys would be fairly disappointed, I gotta say.
Yeah.
But I think we found the headline for this podcast: the hidden value of podcasting.
There you go. And because it's hidden, it's not going to be reflected in that $1 billion valuation that's being thrown at podcasting. There is a hidden value to podcasting that podcasters and guests on podcasts should not miss out on, right? That there is that hidden value.
Yeah, I think that's actually even more exciting. If I was a brand new podcaster and I was coming into the industry and I hear that, right, there's this hidden value and I have somebody clearly explain all of it, I'll be so freaking excited. And I see you pointing at Alex, and I see Alex kind of like warming up in there. What are you thinking about?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that might be a good way to express what we were talking about. Like, how do you articulate that? It's not just about monetization, and maybe that's going to be the talk that Alex and I want to give is the hidden value of podcasting.
Yeah, thanks for inspiring that, guys.
Yeah, we're totally going to steal that, by the way.
So I'm coaching right now, and I don't do too much coaching. I always try to stay fresh. I always keep 2 people, and I don't charge them. One right now, typically it's somebody newer in podcasting, but right now one of them happens to be one of the biggest female podcasters in the world.
Wow.
Massive podcast. And she came to me saying, Alex, my business is doing really well, but my podcast is costing me money. I need to make that hit 0 so I can just not have to worry about that, not see it in the balance sheet every month. And she's making millions of dollars a year. She's doing very well, but not through her podcast. So she was asking me, how do I find 4 sponsors to offset all the production? And I listened to her podcast before we got on this call. I was like, hey, listen, I got to be real with you. I'm like, why do you want to do that? And she's like, oh, I don't want it to cost me anything. And I was like, okay, but you're not selling your coaching package that she does sell a lot of that starts in the 6-figure range. And I'm like, why don't you just sell that and just count it as offsetting the cost instead of muddying the waters? Because she's like, I want 4 ads on every podcast episode. I think it can break even, help me figure out who they should be. I'm like, no ads. It's just an ad for your coaching service or bring them into some sort of funnel that might bring people into it. And that would be it. And she was like, I never really thought of that because she's seeing the size of the industry saying, okay, well, if there's 18 or $19 billion in this thing, I surely can get myself 100,000 of it a year to be able to offset all this cost. But she was, and she admitted, she's like, I've definitely been limiting the power and the authority, the hidden value that I can get through this podcast.
Yeah.
And you highlighted that hidden value and you encouraged her to not go for the short money, right?
Right.
Like getting that sponsorship, that's short money. You're going for the long value, which is I want people to come into the funnel of understanding my content, all my content, not just my podcast. Yeah. That's great.
You know, real quick, here's the thing on that that's really important. If I'm somebody listening that has 6 figures to spend on a coaching package and you play 4 ads in a row, I'm imagining you're going to lose me because I don't have time for that, right? If I have enough money to drop 6 figures for you to help me get better at what I'm doing, I'm probably not going to listen to those 4 ads. I'll be like, this is probably not the podcast for me. So you might actually lose really 6 figures by trying to scrape to get that much within a year.
I mean, not only that, but like the time and resources that is trying to go find those sponsors, trying to control and build a relationship with those sponsors, managing, like, there's a whole set of, like, a whole business side that is just dedicated to that, right? So it's not only the money that's bringing in, but then also how do we manage that long term as well? Is that the benefit? And, you know,
I mean, you can also join a network that can do that for you, but then they're going to take like 30% of that probably.
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
And you're going to have less control over what they're putting in front of your listeners that you've developed this relationship with.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I have friends and they use Buzzsprout ads. And it works really well for them because they don't have a product or service. They do the podcast for fun, but they wanted to break even with it. They're like, I'm not trying to make money. Like, I'll make a couple dollars, but I just need to offset my costs so I can keep this hobby going forever. And I respect the purity of a creator with that mindset.
Yeah.
And so for them, I'm like, yeah, absolutely, throw an ad in there. Your listeners aren't going to care because they know you're just here having a good time and you want to bring them along with it. And that's a case study to say that like ads aren't all evil and you shouldn't do them. But again, if you're selling something for 6 figures, sell your stuff, right? But if you're just a creator who's passionate, having fun, wanting to serve people and not looking to turn it into your full-time job, by all means, run a good, well-placed ad that also would be interesting to your listeners.
Yeah.
It'd be cool to play with that too, right? I'd be like, hey guys, you're going to hear some ads. I got to get a new microphone, dude. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it would be fun to kind of play with that of like, you might hear an ad and I'm going to vet it. It's going to be an ad that's, you know, at least tangentially related to the podcast, hopefully. Right. But hey guys, give me a break. Right. Like, not enough of you are supporting me on Patreon and I got to play some ads. You know?
Speaking of Star Wars, do you need a new toothbrush?
Exactly.
But definitely, I'm a believer that honestly, like, that sells, right? And it's just not that you're going just, again, for the dollar amount, but if you're trying to build that community sense of people, it's like, hey, look, I'm transparent. This is what's going on. I'm trying to deliver better content. This microphone is about to break down. Guess what?
Yeah.
I'm having an ad right here for you.
Educating listeners, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that happened, I don't know, right before the pandemic, I feel like there was this awakening to social media of the impact that it's having on us. And it's like, wait a minute, it's not free. You think it's free, but it's not free. And everyone's like, whoa, this is blowing my mind. We need that realization in podcasting, right? That if podcasting is free, it's not free. What's the real value exchange that's happening? And listeners need to be made aware of that. And one of the ways that we can do that as podcasters is educating them and saying things like, hey, just so you know, this might be a 30-minute podcast, but I spend hours editing it and doing all these other things that make the podcast happen. And I'm not complaining about it. I just want you to know, and you should consider, if you get value out of my show, you should consider supporting the show, right? Otherwise I'm going to put mattress ads.
That has been so interesting with the studio, right? Because the perspective where people come in and be like, oh, I just want to do, let's say 15, 20-minute conversation, but they show their references, and it might be a highly edited thing with like these sounds and different things. And we just produced Fonzie just produced an incredible trailer for a wedding planner, right? And it has like, she's telling this story and there's all these things happening in the background. You can actually imagine the story because of the sounds. It's really an amazing thing. And it was like a one-off product that we did for her. And, but it set the bar really high. And we had to explain to her, be like, look, every episode, if you want it like this, it's going to be 4 times as more expensive than a regular conversation, right? And it's like that education side of people trying to come into the world, right? And start producing it. And we're all about, hey, put your message there, share. Like, it's your duty. If you really believe that what you do helps somebody else, is your duty to put it out into the world. But at the same time, we need to be educated, like, what does it take for us to do this, right? That's what, for example, I love both of your platforms, right? With Podmatch is you get connections right off the bat with people that align with your message, and you can make that connection to then continue on that hidden value. And then with Buzzsprout, for example, that's our service of choice here in the studio when we launch a podcast, because it's so easy. The reason we were able to launch our podcast was because of you guys, because we logged into that website, and you made the process so easy to like, oh, I have to put the title here. Oh, I have to put the description, and then upload the MP3 file. Yeah. We have all those, and you have all the support. So removing the friction from the actual, act of publishing it is so big. And as a podcaster, like you guys both mentioned, if we help our listeners to understand that, and the industry is just going to continue to grow. Yeah,
I want to pinpoint something that you mentioned here a little bit ago, and I think it's a great takeaway for you listening right now, which is get people invested. And I think it's a great tip, especially for indie podcasters as well. Let them know the work that you're putting in. And this translates beyond podcasting, right? When you're building a new relationship too, like, don't be afraid to tell them, hey, I've actually spent X amount of years, learning this stuff. I've tested it. I've had this amount of clients. Like, that is part of your journey. That's why it's important also to share your story, but you're going to get people invested into you and into listening more. So hopefully, right, that relates to the right people. It repelled the wrong people. And then you're going to have a higher affinity with the people that stays listening to your podcast.
Yeah. I think one of the things that Alex and I were talking about just a little while ago was this idea of premium content, where podcasters are like, oh, well, I don't have premium content. You're like, all of your content is premium content, right? Like everything that you're doing it because you think it's valuable to your listeners. And so it's almost like we need a confidence builder, right? Yep. We need to have a confidence builder. And it's hard because you're, sitting behind a microphone and there's nobody in front of you to tell you how valuable the content is you're creating. And so it's daunting and it's definitely challenging, but we have to have that kind of confidence boost. That I was trying to think, the SNL, you're good enough, you're smart. You need to play that before you do. Like, you are producing something valuable. If it wasn't, then nobody's going to download it, right? If nobody's engaging with your content, then maybe it's not valuable. But if they're actually engaging with your content, then you have to be confident in that, right? And now it's educating them on, I hope you're getting value out of this. I want you to know I've been doing this for blah, 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 and this is how I do it, and giving some of that insight, and it can be a fun way to involve your listener.
Interesting. You mentioned, if maybe nobody's engaging with it, it's not valuable. I think before that, I would actually look at, am I actually putting my podcast and my content in front of people, right? I think a problem is distribution. Yeah. And we tell people, this is kind of like our rules, like, for every hour that you spend creating, like, spend at least 1 hour promoting it, right? Like, putting it out there in front of people, because I feel like a lot have the perception that they are, I'm going to sit in front of the microphone, I'm going to talk, and then people are going to, hear about it. And I think personally, one of the best ways to do it is just building those relationships, right? I remember last, state of podcasting that we did, that you came here, you share one of your best techniques, which was get a listener a day, and you go to these Facebook groups, you find a specific problem that they have, and you're like, oh, look, I actually talked to X, Y, and Z who solves this exact problem. And if you go to my podcast in the minute, whatever, you're going to find the solution right there. And I think that is absolutely genius. So I'm curious, because somebody might be listening to this and they might be thinking, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of effort.
Welcome
right?
to podcasting.
Welcome to podcasting. So I'm curious, what have you seen? And that could be one of the downsides, and I'm doing air quotes here for those listening, but that could be one of the downsides of podcasting, right? That it actually requires a lot of resources. What other challenges have you seen, especially working with a lot of people that are coming into the Podmatch world?
Well, first off, like, what has ever yielded a meaningful result to you that didn't require work, right? Like, what in life has ever been like, well, one day I showed up to work and I got bonuses every day for the rest of my career there. It's like, no, you had to show up and you had to work really hard if you were going to get noticed, to get promoted, to get bonuses, like, right? And it's not any different with content creation. You've got to be willing to actually put in some real work. And unfortunately, where any sort of like real content creation comes in, like if you're doing video, audio, even written content, anything like that, like, you have to put your feet to the ground after that. You can't just build it and they will come. Like, that doesn't really work. And we all kind of want that viral, I guess, opportunity to show up where it's just like everyone just found it, the stars aligned and it got there. But the reality is that's very few people's experience in anything online, right? And especially with how many people are there, that, like, it's harder to find, even though it's easier to find, right? There's so much there. But I think that for me, with going out and reaching out to one person every day, it takes a lot of time the first time I do it. But after that, I'm able to identify, you know what? And my podcast is about podcasting. So when someone's always saying, I wish there were some other ways to monetize my podcast, I now have just built a text expander. It's a little code. I'm not rewriting it every time. I'm basically being like, oh man, I hear you. Like, that can be really tough. I did put together a list of 16, and I've got a couple of them on this podcast episode if you'd be curious to hear it. All I did was type in 3 little letters and it's there. And so for me, that day was me clicking a link that I've already saved where people are typing in that type of search. It shows up. I literally type in 3 letters, hit send, and I connected somebody that day. I'm done.
Smart.
Right?
Systems and processes.
Right, exactly. And so, the first time it takes a little bit of time, but my thing is, people are like, oh man, but one a day. dude, after 365 days, based off the data that you're sharing,
Right.
I'm already close to like, that's probably putting me top 15 percentile, right? Or something like that of all podcasters. I'm like, so do it for 2 years. Now I'm in the top 10%. Just keep on doing that.
They also stay, they recommend other people. They're like, hey, you should listen to this. This guy was super helpful.
You're right, because they met me. They're like,
yeah.
hey, the host himself sent me this. Like, they're probably going to be more likely to share as well. So yeah, it has a tail as well. It continues to go.
This is, I'd be interested to hear what percentage you guys assign to this concept. So I was just at Podfest, in January, and I was talking to somebody, and she was saying how much she loves podcasting. Like, I got into podcasting, I love it, but I kind of feel like, I got bamboozled because I had this vision of being behind the microphone and talking about this topic that I love, and really that's about 10% of my time. 90% of my time is doing all these other things that nobody talked about. Nobody told me about these other things. And it was good for us, for Buzzsprout, because we're always thinking about that 90% and how can we shrink it? How can I make it so that you spend less time? So like co-host AI is our AI that gives you title recommendations and descriptions, not to do it for you, but to hopefully shrink how much time you're spending outside of that recording. But anyways, we were having this conversation, and she put it at like 90-10. What number would you put at in terms of time behind the microphone versus time not behind the microphone where you're actually working on your podcast?
That's a really good question. I think first I'm going to lead with is your own decision, right? And it goes back to when we first launched the show, right? So we actually had a show before called Brews and Bros. And it was me and Fonzie talking marketing or documenting the things that we were doing at the time in his room. And like the setup would take an hour because it was his room. We had to move the bed, put the lights, and then dismount it all because he was living there, right? And then after
I had to sleep somewhere.
and then we called that the porn set, right?
My girlfriend will come in and she's like, is this a podcast? Are you sure? I promise a podcast.
2 a.m. and they were like, you guys still recording? And we're like, yeah. And it's like 2 cameras, and then we had the wrong cameras, right? Because they had 20-minute timers, so we had to get up and click it again. And this was all before.
Talk about friction.
And then we'll do the content, and then after that we're like, oh, we now have to download the files and edit the files, and we're like, what? After 5 of those, we were like, nope, equipment to the closet, and we waited a full year to then launch Content is Profit. And when we launched Content is Profit, the decision was, let's make it as easy as possible so we can actually connect or talk about what we wanted to talk. And then almost with like 2 clicks, it's published. So the decision was, there's not going to be a ton of post-editing. We're just going to grab the audio that's recorded from the live conversation, and that's what goes out. And then what happens was it removed the friction from what are we doing? What are we talking about today? So if it was a solo episode, it's like, what did we learn today? What did we learn this week? Let's talk about it and give our opinion. That was the decision. Then we're going to start bringing people on. Do we do a ton of research on them? No, probably we're just going to listen to an episode of, what they did or what they sent us in the form, and we're going to go off the cuff, curiosity based 100%. To this day, that stays like that. And then, so there's not a ton of like crazy research, and we also knew who we wanted to talk to. So we kind of knew a little bit about it. Then the show is like our 1 hour, let's spend together, let's have this conversation, truly enjoyable. And then the post-production was the same thing. We're like, we literally grab the file from here to the computer, upload it to Buzzsprout, right? And then in the session, we will come up with ideas on, you guys see us typing here now. That's what's happening. We're trying to figure out like, what is the hook of the episode? And then that's the thing. So post-production was really tiny. And then obviously it comes with distribution. So we have those 6 levers, which was the presentation that we talked about,
And then you've got promotion. Right? Because then after you
got
got the promotion, now I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to other people.
Exactly. So the rule is like, okay, if we spend 1 hour, I mean, all the pre-production was like the time on, inviting the person and then setting it up. And like you said, it takes time the first time, but afterwards it's just the same link that gets sent out every single time. So it doesn't spend too much time, but it's like, if we spend 1 hour creating, well, when the episode's out, can we book that 1 hour and send it to them, publish it on social media, XYZ, like what are the distribution methods that you have? So 2 hours, 3 hour subs, and then that allowed us to do 3 episodes a week for a long period of time. Now I think this is 500 something episode, which is crazy. I haven't done, besides soccer practice.
We need an update on that play, just saying.
Your pod award? Yeah. We'll get you there, don't worry.
So again, I think it comes up to you, right? Like if you're somebody as a perfectionist like Fonzie, you'll spend 4 days editing 1 episode, right? If you are like frictionless like me, I'll be like, no editing, bro. It goes out that way. And I'm comfortable that way. So like I ask you, the audience, like, what are you comfortable with, right? And then put something out, learn from that, and then you might vary those levers a little bit with like, oh, we need a little bit more distribution, then let's invest more time in there. I need more production. Can we invest resources or editors in it? Or can I edit, right? And then you can start playing with that.
I think thinking about long-term goals works too, right? If somebody, sure, they want to grow, but they don't mind growing very slowly in a period of, 5 years, they might be able to spend more time behind the mic, just talking and not promoting as much. But if the goal is to grow the podcast, maybe find different ways of revenue, right? Maybe find the hidden value of listeners that can potentially become some of your customers, then you might have to go out there and spend a lot of time promoting your podcast and not as much time behind the microphone, sharing your expertise.
For me, I was talking to a podcaster, and they talked about they do a lot of editing, and I was like, oh, I know you have. I knew they were bringing a little bit of income. Let's put it that way. So I was like, hey, you can totally outsource it. And it's like, that's actually my favorite part. And I was like, oh,
interesting. Yeah.
And so we're not saying to anyone who's checking this out today that you need to stop editing or you need to stop posting on social media and outsource all this stuff, right? Because Tom, you and I talked about that. Like a lot of people podcasting coaches, traditional ones, outsource all of it, right? I'm like, that doesn't work for everybody, right? Like there's money involved when you do that. But the reality is this person really liked it. So when I was talking to them, like, oh, why don't you edit a few other people's podcasts too? And they're like, oh, that's a good idea because that's their favorite part. Yeah. So now I think they just surpassed 10 podcasts that they're editing. So cool. And I think they started working with an agency. So they're like, it's not even their own company. They're just doing what they love and now it's their job and they just have their podcast as well. So I'm like, man, so there's no one size fits all that we all just love this, right? Yeah. Being behind the mic, sharing that 10%. For some people, it might be the other elements of it. And some people just are very curious and want to learn all of it, which again, there's nothing wrong with, but I do agree with doing your best to remove the friction points. And I always say, do what you can with excellence. So an example, if you hate Instagram, then just don't post to Instagram. Yeah. You're right. And if you can outsource it, great. But if you're just absolutely despise it, don't let that be what ruins your podcasting experience because that isn't podcasting. The only thing you have to do to podcast is talking to a microphone, hit record and post it somewhere, right? And I'm not saying don't do the rest, skip it all, right? But if you truly hate it and it's going to make you stop doing this, the actual recording, then stop doing the thing that's keeping you away from it.
Yeah. We have a resource for that, right? The publishing pyramid. I'm going to plug it in here. If you guys are curious about it, make sure you send us a message, right? Hey, Fonzie, I want the publishing pyramid. We'll send it to you. And, and there we discuss all about messaging, consistency, capacity, and resources, and how to manage that so you can spend time doing whatever it is that you love.
That's a really good question, man. And I think, part of that is education gap, right, in the industry, right? A lot of people go into this, say, hey, let's do the Star Wars.
Yeah, the education gap is really what struck me was that when she got into podcasting, she wasn't aware that there were all these other functions, right? The editing, the sharing on social media, the promoting, the thinking through, the spending time getting a guest, right? There's all this friction that there are ways around it. There are ways to alleviate that. But she didn't even know it existed. So she just thought, I'm just going to talk behind a microphone,
Yeah, can't tell you the amount of people that has walked into the studio and said, I want to be insert really big podcast, right? Let's say I want to be, I just want to be like Joe Rogan. I was like, all right, dude, do you got 10 years, right? 10 years and loads of resources because that's what it's going to take. And it doesn't necessarily, promise you that you're going to be all the way up there.
I always remember this conversation we had with a real estate person from Orlando. And the initial call that we had with them, she's like, I want to be the Mr. Beast of real estate. And I'm like, well, how long have you been creating content? And I think it was just a couple months. I'm like, are you willing to give houses away to people? And they're like, no. Have you seen Mr. Beast content lately? And that was the stage where he was just giving away a bunch of stuff. And it's also perspective, right? At the end of the day, different people, different markets. What can we do? And I think it's, when one of the biggest moments in my professional career has when my coach told me, do a time study. What are you spending time on, right?
Ooh, that's good, yeah.
And it opened my eyes to many things. And as a content, I think we need to do a content audit on what are we spending the time in? What do I actually like to do? What don't I like to do? And then based off of that initially, because we're the ones producing it or doing it or creating it, then you can decide where to go. Like you said, do what you do with excellence, right? And, once you decide, okay, podcast is the vehicle, great. For us, we tried Facebook Live, we tried YouTube vlogs, we tried all types of content, right? Scheduled content, not scheduled content. And then we found in podcasting the way that we enjoy creating because we love having these conversations. And that's what helped us stay consistent, right? So I think that audit initially maybe podcast is not the vehicle for you.
The audit, I love that idea of going and looking through how you're spending your time. And one thing that we've been talking about in our office, just in general, in the way that we work, is assigning red or green to the things that you're doing. Red are the things that suck the life out of you, and green are the things that give you life, and trying to balance it out. Make sure that there's enough green activities in your work, because otherwise, if everything you're doing is red, you're just going to burn out. And I think podcasting is too hard for people to live in that place of only doing red things. So I love the idea of doing an audit and then assigning a red or green to it. And if it's red, look for ways around it, right? That's where something like Podmatch, if you don't like finding the guests and organizing all that, then you can use something like Podmatch. If you don't like all the editing of the audio, then Buzzsprout has magic mastering to normalize all your audio and things like that. But figuring out what are the things that are red and then try to find ways to minimize it. There's gonna be some part of your work that's going to be red. But you want to make sure there's enough green so that it's sustainable for the long term, because nobody gets into podcasting to flame out. We get into podcasting because we want to do it in the long term. And so I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Energy management. I actually remember
management.
listening to how I met, no, what was the podcast? How to Conquer the World. It's a really good podcast about biographies. Totally recommend it if you guys haven't listened to it. And they did an episode about Edison. And I remember the host sharing, something that I found in common between, Edison, Napoleon, all the big figures that he has portrayed on the podcast, is that they all had great amounts of energy. It's not that they were geniuses. They just had a lot of energy. And what you're doing, balancing the green and the red, I think is key, especially nowadays, right? Like where there is a message. Some people have the message of, the hustle culture, just go 24/7.
Just grind, man.
Yeah, just grind. Like it's not real. Some people might be able to do it, right? Some people might have the energy, but it gets to a point where you need to start balancing other things in your life, right? And I love the concept of Jesse Itzler. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he called it the big ass calendar, right? And so Jesse is a very big entrepreneur. He sold companies to Coca-Cola, to Warren Buffett. And now he has this concept of the big ass calendar. First thing he does in his year is, what is this big rock that I'm going to put on my year? He called it the Misagi. What is this big event that I'm going to put on my year that is going to fuel me for the rest of the year? Then he goes in and he adds what he's going to do with his family, all these events. And then he goes and he adds the work stuff that he has, right? Again, he is at a privilege spotting his life, obviously, financially, where he can have the time to do a lot of other things. But I think boiling down the concept to the day-to-day, podcaster and entrepreneur is look at it as, okay, how can I prioritize my green activities, and then I can include the red ones in there so I can keep my energy high and perform, at the highest.
Yeah. There's sometimes, so for myself, as I've gone through it, there's some activities that I do that are green that aren't necessarily the most valuable use of my time, right? Like as somebody who's running a business, there's other things that would be more valuable than, for example, me writing code. But I love writing code, and it's green for me. And so what I'll do is I'm looking at a day that's stacked with red. I'm going to throw in there writing some code, because even though it's not the best use of my time, even though it violates the, Stephen Covey, important, urgent, right? Even though it kind of violates that, I'm going to do it because of energy management. It's like, at the end of the day, I don't want to feel like I just barely made it through the day. I want to feel like, I did something today. And even if I go and I write code, even though somebody else could do it, maybe they could even do it better, it's still worth it for me to do for that energy management.
Yeah. But I think finding your own how, it boils down to what is your own how. A lot of people will sell you, this is the only way you can do things. But at the end of the day, you got to look inside of yourself, get to know yourself. What are your values? What are your goals? And then find your own how.
What are your red and green activities, Alex? Some of them.
So this topic, I'm going to bring it back to podcasting, because this is like time management, energy management is like my big thing, and it will take us off podcasting. So I'm going to bring it back. So for me, I every 90 days evaluate everything I do in my life and work, everything. I write it all down, and I give it 3 different distinctions: automate, delegate, eliminate. Everything goes through automate, delegate, eliminate. And to bring it back to podcasting, one of the things that I realized I was spending my time doing, it was about 12 minutes a day when I tracked it, was setting up and breaking down my studio, which is also my office. And so I was like, how do I what can I do with this? That 12, how can I reclaim that 12 minutes a day, which isn't much, but 12 minutes turns out to be something I hated because I was like, I forgot to turn on this freaking light, like it was always that. And so I was like, okay, it's not software. I can't really automate this. I could delegate it, but that would be absolutely absurd to have someone show up and like set this up for me. So how do I eliminate it? So I used to have like a roll down back wall, which instead I took that off and painted the wall. Now I don't have to roll that up and down anymore. The lights, I put them all in a certain spot where they're more out of the way, so I don't have to move them anymore. I got basically a switcher that turns everything on by pushing a button. And now I save that 12 minutes a day. So what I did is I just eliminated it completely. Yeah. And so that was one of the things in podcasting. I was like, oh man, I always forget something. I start recording and realize I'm missing a light, or I didn't turn on my microphone. And now it's just always set up. So I was able to eliminate that. So in 90 days, when I go back and look at the list, that's no longer something on it. And so that's kind of how I evaluate everything: automate, delegate, eliminate, are my three things. Every 90 days, I take inventory of everything in my life and run it through those dispositions.
Yeah, I really like that. There's actually studies being done about the time that it takes for you to not want to do something. And I think it's like about 2 minutes, right? So it's like, right, and this is mostly to break down like bad habits. It's like, can you make something wait 2 minutes and then you might change your opinion about it, right? So, for example, I'm kind of like a junkie with like trying to learn about productivity. So it's funny because I'm not productive because I'm looking at videos about productivity, that type of deal, right? But it would be a matter of, okay, how can I make logging into YouTube difficult, right? The process, putting it away for like 2 minutes. So now I have an app that blocks all my apps for hours. But it also goes back the concept of podcasting. When we first started, that we had that set in my room that was awful. Took us like an hour to set up. When we started Content is Profit and we had a different office right here, like 2 buildings down, what we did was, let's pick a corner. It's a tiny office, but we're going to have a corner that is a podcasting corner. We're going to have the mics set up all the time. The only thing that we have to do is plug the computer and that's it. And you remove so much of the friction, so much of the, I have to go set up. I have to do X, Y, and Z even before I get started. And that is such a crusher tip. I like it. I think take the actionable spot, the delegate or eliminate. I'm gonna need that written down because we're gonna use that one.
I really think this is a great conversation to have about podcasting, because we see so many people that get into podcasting and then burn out, right? And so I think it really is it's an important conversation. I love it because we talked about the hidden value of podcasting, massively important for podcasters. We talked about energy management. I think that's massively important for podcasters, because if they don't manage their energy, they're going to burn out. They're going to get to that place where they just don't want to do it anymore. And I used to love this thing, but now I hate it. Why do I hate it? I don't even know. And so I think it's totally relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, and podcasters are not really just podcasters, right? We might be business owners, so we have families, we have other stuff going on in our lives. So
I thought they just stood behind the mic, waiting for the next time to talk.
In the studio.
That's all we do. When this is over, lights out. We're up. But guys, this has been such a cool conversation.
Wait, I have one last question for Alex here, because you were talking about burnout, and I know that's one of your big missions now with Podmatch. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I hate that it happens, but I love talking about the topic because it's not hard to fix. That's the thing. You just have to set yourself up for success. And right now the data shows that over 50% of people quit before reaching 8 episodes. It's because people have this perception of like, I'm going to hit record and it's going to get out there and everyone's going to see it. And then you realize, okay, podcasting, what we're doing right now is 10% of the job, right? And there's the 90% that you might not find fun. And so for me, it's all around education of you can't expect the result too fast. And that's where the biggest education problem, I think, comes into play. People are like, just hit record, start today. And then you do that a few times and you realize, okay, there's all this extra work. Fine, I'll do it. Oh, but no one's here. And it's like, okay, so should I just stop? And people get burnt out because they're not seeing, they're doing more work than they need to because they're just following what someone tells them to do, right?
Yeah.
And that might be someone's year 5 or 10 doing this and they've added everything to it at this point. But also they're not thinking about like, okay, like it's going to take time to build an audience. Everything like that takes time. And I always use Jerry Rice as my example. Great NFL receiver, right? One of the greatest of all time. The first 18 years of his life, you best believe he was working extremely hard to get to the NFL, but no one knew who he was, right? And finally it turned. And eventually we all get to that point where like that J curve, if you will, right? Like it's going to cost you a little bit up front of time, of energy, of even finances, right? Yeah. But it will be worth it if you stick with it. But some people just can't stay consistent because they've not been told that like, hey, this is how this works, right? And so we watch somebody else and we get this idea of like, it's working for them. Why is it not working for me? And so I think that that's a really important element to talk about, because again, like I hate that 50% of independent podcasters quit before getting any form of meaningful experience in it at all, right? Or like any result at all. And so I'm really passionate to try to find those podcasters before they hit that day, because I find it just takes one person to get in there and say, hey, let's focus this thing in. I'm not there trying to make money. It's funny because like my product Podmatch, whenever someone's like, what's your angle? Like, you're just trying to make money off of me. I'm like, literally, if you stay with me for a year, you're going to make like $300 and I will lose that $300. Like I don't make money from podcasters. That's not where I make my money, right? But I'm here to serve you. And so like it makes it really easy for me to kind of jump in, because I always feel like, hey, I really am here to help, because I'm going to be a partner of yours along the way. So I just want to see more independent podcasters make it, because I find that that's some of the most powerful content I've heard. I'm not dogging on the big shows and stuff, but most of the content that's really been inspiring, changed my life, is a podcast I can't remember the name of right now, and is a guest I can't remember the name of right now. But it was two people really passionate to serve, showing up and getting that content out there, that eventually led to me finding it and changing my life.
Yeah. We had this conversation at dinner, right? Like all the experts, right? Expert on this, expert on that, different points of view. They're both experts. Really, are they experts, right? And like you, the independent podcast is what I also find very enjoyable, right? Because it's maybe a personal way, like a personal lens on their life, on their experiences, and it is more meaningful to me personally, and that's what really inspired me. To me was this podcast from it was actually a radio show that then they turned into podcast, but it's a bunch of comedians in Venezuela. It's like the Profesor Briseño, like the Briseño professor, right? And it was just him documenting a bunch of stuff that was happening in the country and putting their humor behind it. And our show had music, and when we just joined, I put some music in there. It's because that was no, but they had like the Street Fighter sounds, like the Hadouken, and they would like make these jokes and stuff, and that was inspiration for us to get started in this. That changed our life, right? So I think it's super important. If you're listening, you're an independent podcaster or content creator, go ahead, follow. Hopefully this was helpful today, but go to Buzzsprout, start the show there, or transfer the show there, because it's so easy, so awesome to use.
That's what I did, by the way. I transferred to it, so yes, I did that.
And go to Podmatch, obviously, because like they have so many incredible resources for you to stay consistent and move forward. So guys, like I'm truly an honor to have you guys both in this room. This is gonna be an episode for the ages. Any last ideas or thoughts or advice that you guys want to share?
Thanks for having us.
I'll go with that, but real quick, I'm gonna add one more thing as well. Thank you for having us, for sure. Just if you're creating something, remember that it does serve somebody. And yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but sometimes work is required to really change somebody's life. And I don't mean to like make it sound more intense than it should be, but like really your content might be the humor somebody needs, the education they need, just the voice that finally lets them understand something they never understood. So it's worth it. Even if there's a cost, again, time, energy, finances, whatever it might be, it's still worth it. And so I always encourage people, keep on going, don't give up, because you don't know who it's helping, who's just a listening ear.
Put a dollar value on that, right? Back to where we started. Put a dollar value on. Both of you guys shared a story that the trajectory of your life was impacted by listening to a podcast. Yeah. That's not captured in the how many ever billions of dollars they assign to the value of podcasting. So don't downplay the impact that you can have in people's lives. Most people that are in podcasting are in it because there's something they're passionate about. Yeah. There's some topic that they think could impact people's lives. Absolutely. Right? So I think it's awesome.
Fonzie, any last thoughts?
I don't know about you guys, but I feel the motivation, the passion right now. Kind of like, seeping from this to right here. I absolutely love it. Thank you guys for being here.
It's all green. It's all green.
It's all green, baby.
With that said, guys, thank you so much for tuning to the Content's Profit Podcast. Go ahead and follow the show in your favorite podcasting platform and on social media at BizBrosCo.
That is right. If you feel you are one step closer towards your goal, please don't forget to share this episode and don't forget to leave a 5-star review. See ya.
Bye, guys.
Don't forget to follow these two as well. Obviously, links in the description. Let's go.